Today, we're going to make this cool animated sci-fi background. Let's go! So, we're in the middle of a series of tutorial videos about creating procedural shapes and patterns. Most of what we've done so far has been UI progress bars and buttons, but today we're going to focus on making a background for the UI. Even though I'm showing you how to create specific UI elements like this background today, the main value in this series is the library of subgraphs or material functions that we've been creating. You can combine these together to create your own effects. If you haven't seen the previous videos in the series, I'll link the playlist in the description down below so that you can catch up. And anytime I mention or use one of these subgraphs, you can find the whole list of them down in the description, along with links that take you right to the spot in the previous video where I show you how to make them. All right, let's jump in and make this. We'll start out in Unity today, and then in just a minute, we'll switch over to Unreal and make the same thing in that engine. All right, let's start out today by making a brand new shader. So I'm just going to come down here to our project window and right click in here and pick Create Shader Graph. And this time I'm going to pick URP Canvas Shader Graph because Canvas shader graphs are the ones that can be applied to UI elements. So we'll go ahead and create that new shader graph. And we're going to call this Tech Grid. This is our sci-fi background that we're calling Tech Grid. So I'll open it up and we can jump right in here. The first thing that we're going to do is find the node that we created last week. Last week we created a subgraph, and it's in this procedural folder here under patterns, and we called it animated clouds. So we're going to add an animated clouds node. And again, if you haven't seen the previous video of how to make this, I've linked it down in the description along with all the rest of them. So we have some parameters exposed here that we need to add to our blackboard so that it can open them up so that the user can choose what they want to add for themselves. So the first one that I'm going to create is a vector2, and we'll call this cloud scale. And I'll just go ahead and drag cloud scale in and connect it to this scale input parameter on our animated clouds. We're going to set cloud scale to a default value of 3 and 3. And that's going to give us just a little bit more detail in our clouds here. All right, we also need cloud color 1 and cloud color 2. And that's going to allow our users to control what color they want the background clouds to be. So I can add 2 colors here. I'll call this one cloud color 1. And I think we can just copy and paste it. Yeah, that works. And I'll right click here and rename it, and we'll call this one Cloud Color 2. And let's use some defaults that create the result that I showed you just a minute ago. So Cloud Color 1 is going to be this shade of blue. It's kind of a little bit darker shade of blue. And then Cloud Color 2 is going to be this shade of blue. It's kind of a little bit brighter shade of blue. All right, so we'll bring in Cloud Color 1 and Cloud Color 2 and connect those up to our colors. And now you can see our cloud background there is already starting to take shape. And then the last thing that we want to bring in is a parameter to control the speed, or how fast the cloud pattern is animating. So I'll click here and we'll bring in a float, and we'll call this cloud speed. And we can also bring this one in and connect it up to our speed parameter right there. All right, now by default, that value that we just brought in is 0, which is why the cloud stopped animating. So I need to come over here and set a default value. You know, if I set this to something like 1, you can see the clouds are going crazy. So we have to tone that down quite a bit, and I'm just going to set it to 0.1. which is going to give us this effect that feels a little bit more natural. All right, we've made some great progress so far. We've got our clouds going there. The next thing that we need to do is create our grid pattern. And in order to do that, I need to bring in a node called Square Tiles. And this is also a subgraph that we created previously. Now you can see that the UV coordinates for our tiles are currently using UV0. And for the background, we want to do something a little bit different. Instead of using UV coordinates of the UI element that the shader is going to be applied to, we want to use screen space coordinates so that the grid is uniform across the whole screen. And I actually showed you how to do that in the last video where we made the animated clouds. So what we can do to make it easy to project our grid tiles in screen space is just copy the nodes from the animated cloud subgraph that are already doing it. So let's jump into animated clouds, and we'll come over here to this start place, and you can see that we've got our screen position multiplied by our aspect ratio here. So I'm just going to grab these nodes here and copy them, and then we can come back to our tech grid, and I can just paste these nodes in right here, and this is how we're going to create the coordinates for our square tiles. So I can just take the result of this set of nodes here, which is setting up coordinates in screen space, and wire them into my UVs there. And now, instead of projecting in UV space, I'm using the screen to project my grid. All right, I need to add a couple of parameters to control my tiles as well. And so to do that, actually, you know what? I'm going to pick all of my parameters here in the blackboard that have to do with my clouds. And I'm going to hit the plus button here and create a category. And this is going to allow me to group them. So I'm just going to call this group clouds. And that kind of organizes my blackboard parameters into groups. And now I can create some parameters that are specific to the grid. And the first one that I'm going to create is the color. So I'll come here and create a new color parameter. And we'll call this grid color. And you can see it shows up inside the clouds group, but I can just grab this and drag it out of the group, and now it's on its own. All right, so I'm going to drag this in, and we'll use grid color in just a minute, but first I need to add some parameters to control these values here. So I'm going to create a float, actually a vector2, and we're going to call this one grid size. And we'll default our grid size to a value of 32 and 32. And let's drag this in, and we'll connect it up to this size, or this tiles input parameter here. So you could see before that it was set to 4 and 4, and now it's set to 32 and 32. And you can see that makes our grid a little bit smaller and a little bit tighter. I think that'll work great. Okay, and the next thing that we want to be able to do is control the thickness of the grid. So I'm going to add a parameter that controls this value here that's coming out of my square tiles subgraph. So I'll create a float parameter, and we'll call it grid thickness. And we actually want these grid tiles to be very thin. And so I'm going to take this grid thickness and set it to a value of 0.08. And we can drag this in and connect it up to our thickness value there. All right, we've got a pretty good preview here of our square tiles, but I actually want the grid lines to be anti-aliased. And so in order to do that, I'm going to add in an anti-aliasing node. And what's nice about this node is we'll be able to zoom in and zoom out of our grid tiles here, and they'll have nice anti-aliasing regardless of the distance of the camera or the size of the screen. So I'm going to take the SDF stroke output here and plug it into the gradient input of my anti-aliasing node. And then I'm going to set my anti-aliasing cutoff to 0. And now I've got these really nice anti-alias tiles. And they don't show up really nice here because the grid is tiled a little bit more tightly than the resolution of the preview windows here. But the other thing that I need to do is drag this out here and add a 1-, because I want to invert these so that my grid lines are white and my background is black. All right, now just to see what this looks like with a little bit better view, I can drag this into the base color of my master stack over here. And if I save this, let's open up our preview window and take a look. And now you can see I've got a really nice looking black and white grid. So this is half of the pattern that I'm making. We're almost done. Let's just do a couple of things to finish up here. We want our grid to be tinted the color of our grid color parameter that we added here. Oh, we already added it, so I can just bring this over. And we can just multiply our grid pattern by this color to tint it the color that we want. So if I connect this up to our base color again, now our grid disappears because our default grid color is currently black. And that's not what we want. So let's set our default grid color to a blue value so that it matches the clouds we've already made. Just paste this color in here. This is the color that we're using for the default of our grid color. All right, so we've got our colored grid here. That's looking pretty nice. Now, all we need to do is take the result of this and add it together with our background grid. So I can just make an add node, bring in our background grid, or bring in our background cloud pattern and our background grid, and apply it and wire it in, and bingo. Now we've got a really nice looking Sci-Fi grid. And we've got the Blackboard parameters here. So if we want to change the size of the grid, like if we want to tile these a little bit tighter, we could set it to like 64, for example. And now we've got really small grid tiles. Or if we want to tweak colors, we could take our blue value here and make it brighter. Now we've got really bright background tiles. We can make them yellow even. We can do all sorts of things to control our result here. But this is how we do it. It's a pretty simple shader. And I'll just turn everything off here. And we can take a look at our final grid here. Just kind of clean things up just a little bit. So again, we're creating UV coordinates in screen space, plugging those into our square tiles subgraph, and then creating the anti-aliasing for the output of that. And then we're multiplying that by color, and then adding that together with our really cool animated cloud pattern to create our final Sci-Fi grid or tech grid output. And now the really nice thing about this is I can apply this to a UI element and use it as the background and take some of the buttons that we've created so far in the series and apply those on top, and I've got a really nice looking UI. All right, I hope you enjoyed this. It's a pretty simple one today. Let's go ahead and switch over to Unreal, and I'll show you how to make this there as well. All right, here we are in Unreal, and I'm going to go ahead and create the same shader that we just made in Unity. So I'll open up my content drawer here, and I'm going to right-click and pick Create Material, and I'll just create a new material here. And just like we did in Unity, we're going to call this Tech Grid, and I'll open it up. And we're all ready to get started. I'm just going to change a couple of things here so that it's set up a little bit better for what we're working on. We need to set our material domain here from surface to user interface. And that's going to allow us to apply this shader to a UI element in the engine. Okay, we're ready to start creating our tech grid or Sci-Fi animated background. So the first thing that we're going to do is bring in the animated clouds material function that we created last time. So I'm going to come down here to our procedural folder. And we're going to pick pattern animated clouds. So there's the node that creates our animated clouds. And we can go ahead and plug this into our final color. And now you can see here, we've got our nice animated cloud pattern. There are a couple of parameters I want to expose. We have color 1, color 2, and time. And those control the speed of our cloud. So let's go ahead and expose those. And there actually is one more parameter that I want to add to our animated clouds. So actually, let's do that first. I'm going to jump into the animated clouds material function here that we created last time. And what we need to add is a scale parameter that will allow us to control the size of the coordinates that we're using. So we have these values here. And I just want to be able to control the size. So let's add a new input parameter. And this is a function input, and we're going to set it to a vector 2. And we're going to call this scale. And let's see here. We've got our time value. I want to check and see. So its sort priority is set to 3. So for this one, we need to set our sort priority to 4 so that it'll be at the bottom of our list of parameters. Let's set a default speed value for this. In our case, I'm going to set the default value to 0.1, and then we'll check the 0.1, and then we'll check this use preview value as default. And all we have to do is take this value here and multiply it with our UV input here. So I'll just add a multiply, and this is going to scale the coordinates that we're using for generating our pattern. All right, so let's save that. We'll switch back over to Tech Grid, and now you can see we've got our scale value there. I actually don't like that default value very much because it doesn't show a whole lot of detail here. So let's switch back and change our default value. Let's just set it to 1 and see what that looks like. Oh, actually it's a vector 2, so we need it to be 1 and 1. There we go. Okay, we can save that. That looks pretty good. Okay, so let's go ahead and expose some input values here for controlling our animated clouds. First, I'm just going to hold down the 1 key and click. Oh, actually, I need a color, so I'm going to hold down the 3 key and click. That's going to give us a color. And I'm going to right click here and pick convert to parameter. And we'll call this cloud color 1. And we need to set it to kind of a default bright blue color. So I'm going to pick a kind of a blue value over here. And let's just leave it at that and see what we get. So we'll plug this parameter into our color 1. And then I'm going to duplicate it. And we're going to name this one cloud color 2. And we need to set this one to kind of a slightly darker blue color. So I'm just going to drag this slider down here to get us kind of a darker blue. And we'll plug that into color 2. So now we've got a nice cloud pattern going on there. We also want to control the speed. I've called this parameter time, and I think that's a mistake. I want to call it speed. So let's jump back here into our animated clouds material function, and we'll pick our parameter here that I called time, and I'm just going to rename that to speed. So save that and switch back, and it didn't update here, so I actually have to add a new one, I think. Animated clouds, yeah, now that one's named speed, so I can just plug my 2 colors into the new one. And then plug this into the output color, and then get rid of that one. All right. So we want to control the speed. So let's add another parameter here. I'm just going to convert this to a parameter, and we'll call this cloud speed. And we want to set a default value. Let's set the default value to 1 and see what that looks like. We'll plug this in here, and wow, that is way too fast. So let's try 0.1. I think that maybe is still a little bit too fast, but it might be okay. So let's just leave it there. And then for scale, we're going to want a vector 2. So I'm going to add a vector 2 value, and we'll convert this to a parameter again. And we're going to name this cloud scale. And let's see, for defaults, let's maybe use a value of 3 and 3. And we'll just plug that into scale. And that's maybe just a little bit too big, but I think it looks pretty cool actually. Let's slow down our speed just a tad, just so it's a little bit more subtle. We'll split the speed in half. And I think this is looking pretty good. All right, so we've got our animated cloud set up there for the background. Now we just need to create the grid. And we can create that from a material function that we created previously that's called square tiles. So there's our square tiles material function under procedural helpers. And we just need to take the output of this and add it to our animated clouds. But first, let's expose some parameters just so we can see what we're getting here. So that we can give the user some control so that this effect is kind of customizable. Ah, you know what? I forgot something. The first thing that we need to do, so our animated clouds are being projected in screen space by default. And we want to also project our square tiles in screen space. So I'm going to go inside our animated clouds material function and come over here to these nodes here on the end. And these are the nodes that are setting up our screen space projection. So I'm just going to select those and copy them. And then we can come back to our tech grid, and I'll paste these nodes right in here, and we can use this for the UV coordinates for our square tiles. So basically what we're doing here is taking our screen position and then multiplying that screen position by our aspect ratio of the screen so that our grid is always going to stay square regardless of the aspect ratio of the screen we're applying it to. That's basically what these nodes are doing here. All right, we also want to give the user the ability to control the tiles, or how many times the pattern is tiling, and also the thickness of the edges. So let's go ahead and add a vector 2 parameter here, and we'll convert this to a parameter, and we're going to call this grid size. And let's set it to a default of 32 and 32, and we'll connect that to our tiles input. Actually, let's right click here and start previewing this node so that we can see what it looks like. Yeah, there's our grid tile. So that's what it looks like with a default value grid size of 32. And we're also going to expose this thickness value here. So I'll add a new parameter, and we'll call this grid thickness. There we go. And I can plug that into our thickness value here. And we're going to give grid thickness a value of 0.08. Now, grid thickness controls the outlines or the strokes. And that's not what we're previewing right now. We're previewing the fill. And that's why you didn't see it change at all when we added that grid thickness parameter. But what I'm going to do next is add an anti-aliasing node. Right now, our grid is kind of subject to change depending on the distance of the camera, but we actually don't want that. We want it to be anti-aliased. And so I'm going to add an anti-aliasing node, and we're going to use the stroke SDF and plug that in as our gradient. And then we need to set our cutoff value here to 0. So I'm going to plug a 0 into the cutoff. Now let's preview this node here. And you can see that now we have our thickness value. And if I set thickness to be thinner, you can get really thin lines. Or if I set it to be thicker, we can get really thick lines. But in our case, we're going to default it to 0.08. All right, so we've got our grid and we've got our animated clouds here. I think the last thing that we need to do just to finish off our grid is add a new parameter here that is the color. So I'll convert this to a parameter and we'll call it grid color. And I want to set this to something that's just kind of a nice bright blue color. So I think I'll set it to that and we'll just see what we get. So I'm going to multiply this color by our grid value here. And then let's preview this guy. Oh, you can see I've got a black grid with a blue background, and that's actually not what I want. So I'm going to take the anti-aliasing node here and add a 1- just to invert that. And now we've got a nice blue grid on a black background. Perfect. All right, that's what we want. So I'm going to take the output of our animated clouds here, and we'll create an add node, and we're just going to add the result of our grid with our clouds, and then plug that into our final result. And now you can see we've got our nice tech grid. Ah, very cool. Now I might want to tune some of these defaults. I think I'd like the background to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to select my color here and just darken down these blue values here. Maybe darken down this brighter blue value as well. And at this point, I'm just kind of tuning these to preference. Okay, that looks nice. And then maybe I'll darken down my foreground grid pattern as well because it's really bright. And this is supposed to be a background, which means it's supposed to be kind of subtle. So I don't want it to be too bright. So just kind of tone these things down there. Yeah, that looks really good. All right, now, I think we're just about done here. The nice thing about this effect is you can take the buttons that we've created so far and tune these parameters that we've exposed to the way that you like them to be. You know, set the size of your grid, maybe tune the colors a little bit, and add the buttons on top, and you've got a really nice looking Sci-Fi user interface. All right, the thing that I said before, I really meant it, and that is the real value in this series of videos that I've been creating is these material functions. So I've got square tiles here, I've got anti-aliasing, and I've got animated clouds. And the reason that I was able to make this effect so quickly today is because I already had these subgraphs created. So if you haven't seen the rest of the videos, in the earlier videos in this series, I showed you how to go through and make all of the subgraphs that you see here. And now that we have these, it's really easy to take them and just quickly piece together an effect like this cool sci-fi grid. It's pretty simple. So if you go back and watch those videos and you make this set of material functions for yourself, it'll really speed up your workflow when your art director comes to you and says, hey, we need to make this effect, we need to make that UI element. You already have the library and you're ready to go. You just throw a bunch of them together and you can come up with all kinds of cool effects. All right. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed our video, and be sure to come back next week and we'll go over more procedural shapes and patterns. Have a great week, everybody.